Well, with Biden backing down, Democrats have less than a month before the Democratic National Convention when they must name their nominee for the White House. For the Blue Camp, a year-long primary campaign has been condensed into merely a few weeks now. What happens next? Let's break that down for you in the next few minutes. At this stage, to stand a chance to defeat Trump, Democrats need to re-energize their base with a new nominee. Biden has endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris, but the official selection of a nominee will be made by more than 4,600 Democratic National Convention delegates. The delegates were selected at state party conventions this spring. They typically serve a functionary role, but they now hold the weight of a historic decision. All eyes are now on the convention in Chicago. Biden's withdrawal from the race is not merely unusual. It is unprecedented in modern American politics. The country is in uncharted territory. Never in modern history has a U.S. presidential contestant abandoned his campaign so close to a national convention after sweeping through the presidential primaries. There is no historical record to consult, and so far, the party's rules reveal no clear ground on what will unfold next. Harris is an early favorite to replace Biden, especially after the president's endorsement. But challengers seeking the Democratic nomination could emerge in the coming few days. California Governor Gavin Newsom, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, and Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. They have all been floated as possible replacements. The Democratic delegates are now free agents. They can vote for any contestant of their choice. Even Biden's endorsement cannot force them to follow his lead. The question is, could a Harris challenger win over the delegates? And for more on this, we're now being joined by WION correspondent Jessica Stones. Welcome to the show, Jessica. I was just discussing with Susan here that just a few days ago, U.S. President Joe Biden was adamant on staying in the race, and he clearly said that I will restart my campaigning as soon as I'm out of the COVID-19 quarantine. My question to you is that what led to Biden's change? What changed in a span of perhaps 48 hours?
Yeah, it's a pretty remarkable 180, if you will. And we don't know precisely what changed, but we do know this, that within the last 48 hours, the president did make a big shift. In fact, potentially just in the past 24 hours. And he didn't tell anybody but his most inner circle. In fact, his closest aides in Rehoboth Beach, where he's currently self-isolating, did not even know up until a minute before he released that statement at 1:46 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or I should say Eastern Daylight Standard Time here in the United States. And he also did not inform top Democratic officials, many of which who had been calling either publicly or moreover privately for him to step aside and allow a new person to be at the top of the ticket. We do know that pressure had been building on President Biden to step aside ever since his disastrous debate performance about 3 weeks ago. And more recently, the calls had become even greater by people with more and more influence. And we do also know that this week Congress returns. There's going to be a series of hearings that will assure that Congress returns after the Republican National Convention has been completed. And there was an expectation here in Washington that there would be additional calls for him to step down. So by doing this on a Sunday evening, he could potentially dip into some of the natural bounce that Republican National Committee usually gives to its candidate, meaning that Donald Trump does not currently own the news cycle. Joe Biden does. And that's, of course, a key win for the Biden, potentially the Harris ticket. And now we are already seeing a lot of conversations here in Washington about where does this go from here? And that is a burning question here, especially for political nerds like myself.
Well, absolutely, Jessica. The pertinent question is also what happens to the Democratic National Convention? How will this perhaps impact the party's campaigning going forward? Stay with us. I'm also being joined by Stephen Golub, law and political analyst, and he's joining us live from California. Welcome to the show, Mr. Golub. Your first reaction to this news coming in with U.S. President Joe Biden dropping out of the 2024 re-election bid, and something which has not happened in the U.S. since 1968.
What a difference a day makes. wow, 24 hours, there were many Democrats and some independents and even disaffected Republicans who were despondent about the fact that Biden's political fate was up in the air, who the Democratic nominee would be was up in the air. And it seemed like Trump had an increasingly good chance of winning in November. Now, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say in tens of millions of households across the country, mainly Democratic, but also independent and some disaffected Republicans, people are breathing easier, are feeling lighter because they see the possibility of a successful Democratic nominee who will not only stand up for their party's policies, but even more importantly, will stand up to try to preserve democracy in this country. And make no mistake, that's what's at stake here in the race against Donald Trump. It's not a normal race in the sense of disagreements about taxes or foreign investment or foreign policy or even immigration. It's about a fellow who pretty unmistakably has shown very strong authoritarian tendencies, Donald Trump, whether he'll be back in office and will pursue those tendencies much more strongly the first time around. After all, he provoked an insurrection, watched on TV in the White House for 3 hours as the commander-in-chief, watched with glee, according to some staff members, while this insurrection, the takeover of the U.S. Capitol, was going on, has talked about pardoning the insurrectionists, has talked about going after his political opponents, prosecuting them. And don't just take my word for it in terms of his authoritarian tendencies. Take the word of courageous Republicans such as Liz Cheney, the former representative and daughter of the very conservative former Vice President Dick Cheney, David Frum, a former George W. Bush speechwriter, many courageous conservative journalists who've made clear that Trump is authoritarian and therefore have turned against him, as well as political scientists and historians from Harvard, Yale, and many other leading universities who come to the conclusion that Trump is an authoritarian danger to democracy. So that's why I'm going on at length here, because that's what's at stake, among other issues such as abortion, women's rights, other very important issues. But that's why a lot of people are filled with more hope now and excitement about the possibility of a new candidate, be it Kamala Harris or someone else, taking on Trump more effectively in November.
Right. Just to follow up on that, Mr. Golub, latest YouGov poll shows that the difference between Trump and Harris is not a lot. It's a clear neck-and-neck competition. How do you see this U-turn in American politics, which has rather entered uncharted territory, resonating amongst the Americans? Are they up for a Trump versus Harris face-off in the November elections?
Boy, uncharted territory, that's the right word or words to use. The key thing that I'd be interested in is how are they doing against each other in what we call swing states? Because we have such a peculiar and really in many ways dysfunctional presidential election system that it's not how the national polls go, but how Trump and Harris are doing against each other in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin in particular, and a few other key states. So we'll see how that plays out. Now, the dynamic could change over the course of the campaign, including by virtue of the fact that Harris is not a lock by any means to secure the nomination. Right now, I give her a 75% chance, given that there has been a lot of support that's come up for her. She is the sitting vice president. But as was previously discussed here, the fact that President Obama, arguably still the most influential politician or former politician in the country, has denied his support to Harris. He's spoken favorably, but has denied his support to her, is really significant. Let's see what Nancy Pelosi and other leading Democrats do. If they also come out in favor of a process to determine the nominee rather than simply endorsing Kamala Harris, we could see others stepping forward, and we could see, in combination with poll results about her popularity or others' popularity, a different nominee.
Right, Mr. Golub, just to add to what you said, that Barack Obama has, of course, lauded Biden, but he has not named Kamala Harris as the party's nominee. Rather, he said that the party will choose an outstanding contender. Stay with us. I'm also going to our VOA correspondent, Jessica Stones. Thank you for staying with us, Jessica. Talk to us about the reaction on the ground there with this decision of Biden stepping out of the 2024 race. Do you think that this decision will perhaps re-energize the voters, especially those who are anti-Trump and are now admiring Biden for making this decision?
Well, the more likely reason that they would be energized is simply because this is no longer an election between two very advanced in age white gentlemen. This is now a race, if Harris takes the top of the ticket on the Democratic side, but between a 59-year-old, half African-American or Jamaican-American, half South Asian or Indian-American woman who is a progressive from California, someone who has tackled the Senate and who has been a prosecutor and who has a lengthy record in public service. And then on the other hand, of course, the former reality TV star and former U.S. President Donald Trump, who has 34 felony counts against him and other cases that are still pending. So this changes the nature of the race, right? And it does stand to reason that you would get potentially more young people involved in the race. What I find interesting about the kinds of reactions we're seeing here in Washington is that you have a couple of different approaches. You have the approach that some have taken, like Elizabeth Warren, the progressive senator from Massachusetts, who has said, I endorse Kamala Harris, but who also is very open to having a spirited convention. You have Barack Obama, who you have talked about, the former sitting president, who did not endorse Kamala Harris and who is putting his trust instead in a more open approach, an open convention where you would have the delegates that were pledged to Biden potentially choosing to vote for someone else at the convention. And time again, as I've listened to people, some are endorsing, but it would open to other candidacies and some are not. But I do think that there is a perception that they have to be careful of because Harris was not at the top of the ticket when these delegates were assigned to Biden. And so the American public has not yet had and really won't have an ability to vote until November on a Harris ticket. In the primaries, they voted on a Biden-Harris ticket. And so that there is a concern about having the perception that there is enough democratic process going on in this election. Obviously, democratic rights and democracy, a big election issue, as Professor Odin has pointed out. So they need to be careful of having the perception that she is simply being coronated or that any candidate is being coronated by the delegates as opposed to by the American people assigning those delegates. And that's something to be obviously very careful of. The other thing I would point out is that on the Republican side, you are seeing growing calls simply for Biden to step down and not even finish the rest of his term, saying that if you're not fit to serve and run as president, again, you are not fit to serve the rest of your term. And so you're going to see a lot more of that conversation as more congressmen and women and senators return to Washington this week for a number of hearings that will focus on the assassination attempt against the former president and the responsibilities around security. We're going to have a lot more people in town, a lot more voices at the table to talk about reacting to this unfolding news.
Right, Jessica. Coming to you, Mr. Golub, we clearly have an unprecedented situation here where Kamala Harris will make her VP pick as well as she's chosen as the presidential nominee. Likely now. Now, how much of a say will she have, or do you think that it will be a democratic arrangement given the unprecedented situation in the United States of America?
Well, that's a good question. It depends on how the process plays out, whether in fact she just accumulates so much support that she steamrolls through to the nomination, or in response to some of the concerns I think Jessica quite rightly raised, people might favor, especially Democratic leaders, might weigh in to favor a more open process that allows some various other candidates to possibly come forward for Kamala Harris to show what she's got, in terms of a debate or a town hall or impromptu gatherings. And I would like to add how the polls might play out over the coming few weeks to see whether she retains or increases her support, to see once people get a better idea of possible alternative candidates, whether they become more popular, generate some momentum, whether a couple of them might team up in terms of a potential presidential, vice presidential team running together. Getting to the point of if Kamala Harris does secure the nomination, my guess is that she'll pick a vice presidential candidate, maybe certainly in consultation with Democratic leaders who would balance her out in the ticket. The few names that are possible are Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, one of the three most key toss-up states, Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, another one of those toss-up states, or Mark Kelly, a senator from Arizona, who by virtue of being a former astronaut, a former fighter pilot, a wife who unfortunately was badly wounded in a shooting, she's a former U.S. representative, might have quite a compelling story to tell. And Arizona is also something of a toss-up state. So those considerations will be in the air, and those are a few of the people who could wind up as her vice presidential nominee if, in fact, she secures the presidential nomination.